I want to thank the rector of the Santiago de Cali University, Dr. Carlos Andrés Pérez Galindo, and the rest of the authorities for this doctorate honoris causa. For me, it is a pride to be distinguished with this honor along with so many other academics from FAST. I consider that this noble recognition has two dimensions. First, I feel a recognition of the work we have done in the years that we have been in charge, which has served as an inspiration to so many people beyond our own borders. Second, I take it as an inexorable mandate to continue deepening in the path of freedom to be able to make our countries and our region a liberal virgin. That is why it is a pleasure for me to be here on the occasion of the Flemish President Abelardo de la Espriella, to whom I wish the greatest of the successes in his mandate. His victory marks a new step in the region in the change towards the ideas of freedom. The wind of history is blowing in the direction of freedom for the first time in many years. In a few months, we have seen the same phenomenon in Chile, Peru. And now we are here, where President Abelardo also achieved it. Today, it is the duty of all of us to raise the sails and navigate to bring prosperity to our peoples. Long life freedom, damn it. And now the libretto is over. One of the things that I find interesting and that one can contribute to what is in the experience from what I have already said. What is in the experience from what I call the electric chair. We, at the time of assuming responsibility to the front of the government, combined the worst of the three worst crises in Argentine history. We had a monetary imbalance. It is a technical name. In English, it is money overhand, which was twice what we had in the before the road to go to 1975, a traumatic experience that multiplied by 6 the inflation rate, by 5 the number of poor, and that gave beginning to very dark parts of our history. And that both in the political and economic and social. On the other hand, we had an imbalance in the central bank, which was worse than it was going through in the year 1989 prior to the hyperinflation that the government of Alfonso had, and at the same time we had social indicators that were worse than those that were at the exit of the convertibility. That is to say that we had a very complex situation, a situation where also the fiscal imbalance consolidated was 15 points of the GDP, 5 in the Treasury and 10 in the central bank. We had the equivalent of 4 monetary basis beating a day, with which in the course of a day we could know he multiplied the amount of money. In addition, we had the equivalent of 9 monetary bases in pesos, beating in less than 30 days. And inflation was running at a daily rate of 1.5%. Therefore, in fact, the major inflation of the month of December, when we assumed, was located at 54%. That is to say that there were all the conditions for Argentina to have the worst crisis in its history, specifically not only to have maintained the speed that the inflation rate and how the monetary numbers were at that time, we would have reached an inflation of 15,000 or 17,000%. In similar circumstances, Argentina experienced a crisis Huerta. GDP fell between 15 and 10%, which obviously would have destroyed the real wages and would have pushed poverty to about 90% of the population. That was the situation where we arrived, and that we had to make decisions. And there was no time for focus groups or surveys. But for the only thing that there was time was to make decisions against the clock. And in that sense, there's an extraordinary phrase from one of my great mentors. Who was Professor Alberto Venegas Lynch's son, that says there is nothing better or more useful to solve a complex problem in real life than to have a good theory. And we did have clear direction. We did have clear plan of what we wanted to do. Our guide on how to design policies was also marked in the definition of liberalism. That our gracious pro-freedom sponsor has given us, Dr. Alberto Venegas Lynch, Jr., that says liberalism is the respect and restriction of the next person's life project, based on the principle of non-aggression and in defense of the right to life, to freedom and to property. And all the decisions that we have taken have had as a rectory framework. Precisely the definition of liberalism. At the same time, last night I was finishing my recent book, which I think should be the number 18, which is called The Moral as a State Policy. And basically, last night I received the prologue of Dr. Stasnega, who precisely says, well, if one wanted to know what the manual of what we are doing is on economic issues, one would have to look at my previous book, which is called Capitalism, Socialism, and the Neoclassical Trap, and to understand the way in which we make decisions in the political question is the moral as a state policy. And this is very relevant because it shows the way in which we make decisions. And we say that our decisions are based on three pillars. On ethical and moral values, which are the basis of the West. On economic efficiency and on political utilitarianism. And in that sense, there is an order of merit, and there is an order of merit, of course. We've regularly seen throughout our academic debates all the discussions about the problems or how they end up facing. The economy, that is, the economic efficiency against politics. That is political utilitarianism, the attempt to take measures to be able to collect votes and win elections. And in general, that debate that economists believe that we win in the classrooms and in the closets. The biggest problem is that we always end up losing the facts, because the one who cuts the cord is the politician. And when you are talking about cutting public spending, it is cutting power. And that is what they don't want to do. They don't want to give them back their freedom. They like to proclaim it, but they don't want to give them back. And the reality is that, basically, one of those debates has the feeling that he wins, but he always loses the facts. That was also a very decisive element when it came to entering politics. I remember that I was at a dinner, I was with my sister, and in front of me I had a politician who had ideas that were not far from freedom. Then he called his son and brought me an electoral ticket. Then he told me, very interesting, the cultural battle, very interesting, everything. He asked me, but where are the people from my law? And he told me that if I didn't get in, I wouldn't change anything. And the reality is that when you go and watch a football game, obviously I'm going to do it with my colors. And you are going to see a game of Argentine sex. You are going to see that Argentine fans are intense. Passionate, intense. They. Exactly. That is, I would say that any Puccini character is not even close to the heels. Welcome, Anthony. What a pleasure. I hadn't seen you. I'm sorry I didn't greet you. Thank you. You are doing an excellent job. I congratulate you. If something helps. And not only that, we are so intense that we also fill the stands with colors. We scream like crazy. But when you put the ball in the middle of the field, we can scream everything we want, but the ball doesn't move. That is, the one who ends up being the goals is Messi, and the best football player in the history of humanity, leaders. Look, there is the average player among the good. There are players with 2 deviations from the average, or 3. Either Cristiano Ronaldo or Mbappe. Great players, but none like Messi with 6.5 deviations from the average. That is why he is the best of all. And I couldn't stop saying it. So you have to get involved. Because if not, the enemy does it. And we, at the time of arriving, we had to make decisions. And those decisions, we based them on what I have called the state policy. There was 3 blocks. The first block is that of ethical and moral values, which are the basis of the West, and which have 4 chapters. There is a chapter that has to deal with Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy is very interesting in the way in which the problems were thought, how the problems were solved, the dilemmas that man has to face. There is one that I particularly like. That has to do with the conquest of Troy, with the Odyssey, and what happens when you go on your way to Troy. Odyssey, in the face of the smell that said goodbye, Philoctetes, Philoctetes, as a result of being bitten by that bug that crows. It's a socialist. It has to have another name in the animal world. In that context, Philoctetes' feet gave me a truly horrible smell, something that I could not document because I noticed that I have no smell apart from that. Because the other day in some places they made references to what smells and I don't know what they cost. But apart from that, Philoctetes was the best archer that the Greeks had. And then Odysseus throws him on an island and continues. And when he goes to consult the oracle tells him that he cannot win if he does not bring Philoctetes, which is understandable by the logic of Troy structure. He needed archers. Come on, archers. It's a joke. Abusing the Spanish. For my past as a goalkeeper, if you want. But then, what was the point? The point is there. He had to bring him back. And Philoctetes did not accept. If Odysseus did not ask for forgiveness, then what does Odysseus do? He goes on the way to look for Philoctetes with Achilles' nephew. That is Patroclus. And the pointers that he clearly sends him to Patroclus and deceives him to Philoctetes. They take him, they fight and win, that is, they deceive the oracle. But see the nature of that situation. That is, what is he doing? What was he doing? Thus, the solution had been to admit the error, ask for forgiveness to Philoctetes. If winning was so important, that was the correct solution. However, Odysseus did not want to show in front of his peers that he asked for forgiveness and recognized a mistake in front of a soldier, and he grabs and resorts to deception, when in reality the moral solution should have been to take charge, who ask for forgiveness and win. If it is so important, endure the consequences and lose. However, he resorts to deception. That base. Notice that. What is also in the middle is the problem of the ego. So now the question is, he really ended up winning. What? Did Odysseus really win? Let's say he did not want to ask for forgiveness, so as not to damage his reputation in front of his peers. However, he did it by deceiving Philoctetes. Therefore, the way of Odysseus was finished, because all his peers knew that he was a bus driver, and it does not matter if he won or did not win the war. Yes, let's say Troy fell, but his future is over. That is, they can only build a solid victory if you make the right decisions. And if they believed it was right to have rebelled him on an island, Philoctetes, they should also have borne the consequences of that, and that is to see men tolerate defeat. Notice that this is interesting because it has to do with the way they make decisions. If you ask me what I would have done, I would have asked Philoctetes for forgiveness, and we would have won joy. But I would have demonstrated a leadership capable of accepting mistakes, because there is nothing worse than when you make a mistake wanting to deny it. Because what is going to happen is that you are going to continue insisting on the mistake, and you are going to make a set of decisions, all mistakes. His result is worse than what they had. That is equals to illustrate why. Greek thought brings us all the time things that light up and allow us to see these types of problems that one has to be making decisions. For there is something wonderful because he has to do it in the shoes of another. And that then allows him to extrapolate them and make their decisions more conceptually armed. The second point has to do with Roman law. Well, and there is also a distinction. And it is very important between what is natural law and positive law. He can sanction laws and make something legal. But that is legal does not make it legitimate. For something to be legitimate, it has to be in consonance with natural law, which has to deal with respect for life, respect for freedom, and a derivative of it that is respect for property rights, which in the background are neither more nor less than the foundations of liberalism that are mentioned in the definition that Professor Roberto Venegas and Chidjuri uses. Consequently, one has to understand that no matter how something becomes legal, that is not going to make it legitimate. I could get a law where I say, well, from now on, those who do not like me, kill them. Those are the experiences that happened in history, but that does not make it legitimate. That is, it can be legal, but it is deeply illegitimate. And in that the policy has a lot to do and look at the moment of the decision-making. I will later make an application with the adjustment that we made. The third question is the rectitude of the Stoics. Without a doubt, the most emblematic case of the Stoics is that of King Solomon, the wise king. When he inherits the throne, he asks the Creator three virtues. He asks for wisdom to distinguish good from evil, courage to choose good, and temper to stay on the path of good, and having to occupy a position of power like that of a king, or like the one you could have a president. They ask for another virtue, which is to be fair. Because what we are going to see is that when one takes measures that are fair, those measures are going to promote efficiency, and that, we say, is going to derive from political rhetoric. And that, in fact, this is not so modest of what the virtues are. The chapter of the virtues of Adam Smith in the theory of moral feelings, where Adam Smith groups courage and temper in what is self-control, and that allows him to add a new virtue, which is beneficence, but not the beneficence with the other person's pocket, beneficence with their own pocket. And the fourth chapter of the part of the values are precisely the Christian-Jewish values. And I always like to highlight the moment in which the Creator gives the tables of the law to Moses. And what are the Ten Commandments? It is interesting because in the version of the Ten Commandments that are in the book of Exodus are all the elements that make the basis of liberalism. In first commandment, as it is presented in the book of Exodus, it says, I am your God, the one who took you out of the house of slavery of Egypt, the one who gave you freedom. That is, in the first commandment, freedom is declared. That is, the first element that the Creator gives to the human being is freedom.
Le otorga el Creador al ser humano es la libertad.
And there is neither freedom nor property if they do not live before. That is why it is also proclaimed, you will not kill.
No matarás.
It is also proclaimed, you will not steal. Like freedom, life, property.
Vida, propiedad.
It is more when they say not to raise false testimonies, which would sell that to the journalists who spend all the time lying. In that sense, what you see is that there is also the respect of the contracts.
En ese sentido, lo que ustedes ven es que ahí también está el respeto de los contratos.
There is also a part of what it is not to do, and it is beyond the Ten Commandments. But why do I point this out? Because it has to deal with the second analytical block. It is the subject of efficiency. Efficiency can be raised in the static sense or it can be raised in the dynamic sense. In the static sense, you have the traditional analysis of Pareto. But the problem with the traditional analysis of Pareto is that to derive the idea of the invisible hand, that is to say that each one of us guided by his own interest leads to the maximum general well-being, requires in the neoclassical format of a topological structure. And that structure is a very tight suit. And the problem is that, in addition, economists have decided that every time the real life does not coincide with our ideal model, instead of wanting to change the model, we say that it is a market failure, which is an aberration too. If you do not laugh, why is that? If you did not see a microeconomics but core theory of prices, you will see the structure. That is why I like the structure much more, where the proof that Hans Hermann Hoppe does. Because what Hans Hermann Hoppe builds is that using the principle of non-aggression. That is, therefore, the right to life is enforced, the right to property. And if you respect the principle of appropriation of law, the one who discovers something, except that it is of another, is his own. And with those elements, you can derive the idea of what the neoclassics call the optimal Pareto, or what is the idea of the invisible hand of Adam Smith. But by changing the analytical structure of the proof, the problem of market failures disappears. That is, given that the market is a process of social cooperation, where we voluntarily exchange property rights, does the market failure cease to exist? That is, the only way for a market failure to appear is for someone to appear with a gun to their head. Well, that is called the state, but that is not the market precisely. So that makes it, in fact, the basis of my work in the book Capitalism, Socialism and the Neoclassical Trap. And the most interesting thing is the idea of dynamic efficiency. There was a wonderful, extraordinary work by the professor, another of my mentors. That is Huerta Soto, which is called the theory of dynamic efficiency. He defines the theory of dynamic efficiency or dynamic efficiency as that path that maximizes economic growth. And what he discovers is that nothing that is unfair can be efficient. If something is efficient, it has to be just, and if it is just, it is efficient. They are two sides of the same coin. That is, there is no dilemma between efficiency and justice. And that arises from when you incorporate the correct values. There is no more moral relativism, and there is a set of moral values, ethical values that are not negotiated in any way. The right to life is not negotiated. The right to life is not negotiated in any of its states. The right to freedom is not negotiated, and the right to property is not negotiated. If you respect those rights are consistent with the search for an efficient path. And that happens even when he did not know anything about economic growth and embraced in the background the ideas of freedom, which are the ones that sustain these values. You are going to prosper, not at all as countries that are free. They are 12 times richer than the repressed. They have 25 times less of the poor in the standard format, 50 times less in the extreme format. They grow twice. The data is strong, and the ideas of freedom are consistent with the Christian Jewish values. That is, it has been about 4,000 years that we already know how prosperity is embraced. That is, we were expelled from paradise. We cannot return to paradise. But the Creator sent us and gave us the tables of the law, and that if we follow those values, we will prosper. That is where the analysis made by Professor Venegas Lynch-Hijo, the analysis of Hans Hermann Hoppe, despite the fact that he hates me, and of Huerta de Soto, because you are rooted in the values that are what we call the West, which are the Christian Jewish values. We are going to prosper. And naturally, if you make decisions that are fair and that at the same time make them efficient, prosperity is going to follow you. You are going to win votes and you are going to win elections. That is, if we. This is embracing the ideas of freedom. We will bring prosperity, and we will be able to validate that we're currently in the polls. We will generate a century of prosperity for our nations, and we will end once and for all with that fled that socialism is. That is socialism. To finish, I am going to give you a concrete example of how we solved the problem that we inherited. I am not going to do everything because I do not want to receive the omnipotence. But the interesting thing is the correction of the fiscal deficit, a deficit of 5 points of the GDP. A way to fix it. It is not a way to fix it, but we will see why not. It is to be indebted. Now, what is that? It is future taxes. That is, the party of the present is paid by our children, our grandchildren. People who have not even been born. That is, it is deeply immoral to be indebted. It is immoral. That is naturally immoral. How would you like us to have a mega party and pass the bill to our grandson? Do not do it with you. See that the other does it. You will see how bad that looks. Well, now let's put ourselves in the shoes of the grandson. He did not see anything, and he already has his future income mortgaged. He has not even decided what he is going to study, but he already has to pay for the party of all of us. A truly aberrant thing. The other solution is to emit money. Now, if I emit money, that generates inflation, which is an unregulated tax.
Es un impuesto no legislado.
It is a
Es un
robbery,
robo,
like any
un
tax,
todo
but on
impuesto,
top of
pero
that, it
además
is not even
ni siquiera está
regulated.
legislado.
And as if that were not
Y
enough, it
como
is
si
deeply
todo
violent
fuera
because it hits
poco,
the most vulnerable sectors,
es profundamente violento porque golpea a los sectores más vulnerables
and
y
also
además
distorts
distorsiona los
prices,
precios,
which
con lo cual
distort the allocation
distorsiona
of
la asignación de
resources,
recursos y por ende termina
and therefore
perjudicando
ends
el
up harming
crecimiento económico.
economic growth.
Por lo tanto,
Therefore, the
tampoco es
monetary mission
solamente
is not a
eso.
solution either.
La
The
otra
other
solución es
solution is
subir
to
los
raise
impuestos.
taxes, but taxes for some
Pero los
reason are called
impuestos por
taxes.
algo se llaman impuestos. Por eso yo
That is
a
why I
los
say to
pagadores de impuestos
taxpayers,
digo pagadores
taxpayers
de
and not
impuestos, no
taxpayers.
contribuyentes.
That
Es
is,
decir, los
taxes are
impuestos
not
no
paid
se pagan
voluntarily.
voluntariamente. ¿Qué
What is a
contribuyente?
taxpayer?
Contribuyente nada.
A taxpayer is
Son
nothing. They are
pagadores de
taxpayers.
impuestos.
Taxes
Y los
and
impuestos
taxes, you
ustedes
pay
los
them at
pagan a
gunpoint
punta de
because if they
pistola
don't go
porque,
to
digamos,
jail,
si no van presos. Ahora,
now
eso
that
lo
makes
hace
illegal,
legal,
but it doesn't make it
pero no lo
legitimate.
hace legítimo. Por lo tanto,
Therefore,
la
the solution clearly was not to raise taxes.
no era subir los impuestos.
And there we did what no one believed we could do.
Creía que podíamos hacer.
Everyone said it was impossible to reduce the tax deficit of 5 points of the GDP in a mandate, that we could hardly reach a point of the GDP per year. Well, we, following a phrase that Abelardo told me, which I loved, and I told him, I'm going to steal a wishes from Picasso. He says, I dedicate myself to making it impossible because for the possible there are all the others. And then we said, we are going to do what no one did. We made the biggest fiscal adjustment in history of humanity in record time. In a month, we put in order the accounts of the public sector, lowering taxes. In fact, we liked the idea that as the economy began to recover, we lowered 3 more points. And we are the first government in Argentine history to lower 3 points of the GDP in taxes. But that was not enough for us to end the crisis. We had to solve the problem of the central bank, which was twice as big as the problem that we had in the treasury. And there, not only the team of Toto Capito, our Minister of Economy, but also a Secretary of Finance today, Chancellor Pablo Kirchner, and the President of the Central Bank, managed to solve the problem of the quasi-fiscal deficit, which was 10 points of the GDP, and the problem of the debt in pesos. We managed to solve everything using market solutions. We have managed to solve it without confiscations, without theft for the first time in history. We made a stabilization program that did not start from theft for expropriation. We did it respecting the property rights and consumer inflation that went from a rate of 300% to around 25% of an inflation that was on the way to 15,000 or 17,000%. Today, it is around 30%. That is, we have managed to be deeply successful in lowering inflation without violating the property rights. But not only that, they said that if we made that adjustment, we were going to sink the Argentine economy into a recession. And yet, 26 months later, the Argentine economy grows uninterrupted. Not only that, if we take the monthly estimate of the economic activity of December 23, in the first 2 years we have grown 11%, that is, a little more than 5% per year. When in the previous 100 years of Argentine history, the economy expanded by 1% per year. And not only that, it had not grown for more than a decade. That is, we are doubling the rate of growth. By this of having lowered the fiscal deficit and the quasi-fiscal deficit, and having lowered taxes involved returning to the Argentines $100 billion. And those $100 billion have allowed, together with the Minister of Human Capital, Sandra Petroboloi, and the Minister of Security, who put in cash the payments. Because here in Argentina, now the one who makes them pays them. That allowed to return $100 billion to the Argentines, and that poverty in a monthly frequency went from 57% to 29%. That is to say, we also made the economy grow. And we also took 14 million Argentines out of poverty. But not only that, indigency fell from 20% to 6%. And the children, in a situation of poverty of 70%, past 42%. Clearly, we have a lot to do. But if we continue to take as an oath the ideas of freedom, while we change our policy of assistance to the most vulnerable, where we stop giving them the fish to teach them how to fish, which is the concept of human capital, that we also continue to open the economy and also to exploit the growing yields and accelerate the economic growth. We deregulate every day. Today we have 17,000 deregulations practically. That is, we take out a rhythm of 17 regulations per day, we raise them. All that will lead to a virtuous growth process. Our country, the old country risk, when we arrived was in 3,000. Today it is around 400 basis points. That is to say, Argentina, guided by moral values, guided by Judeo-Christian values, put at the service of men, at the service of citizens, and promoting the ideas of freedom. It is coming out of its stagnai. It is coming out of decadence. And with this, embracing Judeo-Christian values, we will make Argentina great again. Thank you very much, and long live freedom.